I'm George Baer. I'm part of the Washington Chapter Board Programs Chair for Washington Chapter ICEAA. Welcome to today's luncheon. Let me share my screen and we will get started. So today we are we have a special guest with us today. It's Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Summers from OSD Cape, and he's presenting how to be agile in a waterfall world. And as I mentioned before, in case you didn't get that information, there's an attachment, a link to an attachment in the chat. So if you could please download that Excel spreadsheet in the chat, then this could be a little bit more interactive as well. So, Lieutenant Colonel Summers is an Army officer with 10 years of operations research experience, has a master's degree in research from the Air Force Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree from the U.S. Academy at West Point. And so I'm going to hand it over to him. One more time, again, in our chat, we have a link to a spreadsheet. Let me stop sharing my screen. And welcome.
Thanks, George, and thanks, Dan Germoni, for inviting me to come and talk with you all today. I think this is the second time I've had a chance to talk before this group, and so really excited to have the chance to talk to you all again. I'm going to try to share my screen now and bring up some slides. I think you guys should be able to see my screen now. Can somebody verify that you can?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, George. All right, so about 5 years ago, I was at the Defense Intelligence Agency as an ORSA there, and my boss asked me to go to an agile course, the product owner course for Scrum. And I was really hesitant about it, and it was like a week-long course, and I didn't think I was getting a lot out of it because a lot of the things that you learn in Scrum, whether it be the product owner or the Scrum Master course or the courses for other agile methodologies, just don't seem to integrate very well with some of our very set government processes. And so as I tried to take that back, what I learned in that course, as I tried to take that back to DIA and kind of struggle through it, I have come to enjoy or to appreciate some of the agile methodologies and some of the ways that you can modify them in order to be able to use them in a government setting. And so that's what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. I did this briefing originally about a year ago for the Army Diversity and Equity Agency, and it went really well. It was like a 4-hour offsite that they were doing, and their director asked me to come back the next day and give the same briefing in an hour and a half to a group of senior executives. And so I did that in an hour and a half. Both of these have been in person, so this is the first time I've really given this in a virtual environment. So hopefully it goes well with this as well. But I think there's three things that for you all in the cost community that there might be some benefit in at least having some understanding of the agile methodology, and that is that you may want to use agile yourself. I think our work building models, building estimates, doing the cost estimating for the Department of Defense or for the government there's some benefits to an agile methodology for what we do and us using it ourselves. I think there's also the chance that we will be direct customers of that. A lot of the contract companies that we hire for different projects, for applications, for databases, things like that, say that they're going to use an agile methodology as part of what they're going to do for us. So understanding what that means and what our expectations should be of that company, I think will be beneficial. And then third, a lot of the things that we buy now have a very large software bill associated with it, and understanding how agile and how that methodology works might help us to be able to cost those software applications a little bit better than not understanding that. So there's a few things that some of you all might have a background with Scrum or with Agile. And so if you do, I apologize. For those of you that don't, we're going to go over a few things that you just kind of have to know before we can talk about Scrum. And so this is a list of that. And so Agile goes back a long time. It probably goes back like 1957 when they were first starting to do some of the integrated software development type things. And it had a lot of growth in the 1970s, but it was really in 2001 when a bunch of the large Agile methodology folks came together and put together the Agile Manifesto. And that's when we kind of see what Agile is today. And so over the last 10 years, it seems like Agile has started to make its way out of just software development, or maybe software development has made its way into a lot more aspects of our lives. And so you hear a lot more about Agile, but it really goes back a long time. So one of the things that we need to know is the Agile Manifesto. And I think this is really where you start to see it grind up against some of our government processes. And I think from my experience with Mr. Germoni, I think some of these things might grind up against him too. We'll hit that in a second. But looking at these, so it values individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So it's really about having those personal interactions with folks to get the software developed or to get the product created. And then the second one is working software over comprehensive documentation. And it's really easy for us when we're trying to build an application or we're trying to make something that we really want to push that every bit of that is documented to the nth degree. But we have to realize that, as we iterate through a software development or through an application development process, what we're really after is making sure that we've got something that's working that we can give to our customers. And I think that's one where a lot of us folks start to have issue with that, because we really want to make sure that what the contractor has done or what we have done is fully documented so that we can do it again, but it's a balancing act there. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So we are wanting this to be a relationship between us and our customers. If we're making an application for them, it's not really about trying to make sure that we are able to get, the most money out of that contract, or that we're able to get that contract nailed down so that we are never going to be held at issue for not delivering something. But it's a collaboration effort, and that's a lot of times a challenge with the government as well. And then responding to change over following a plan. And so obviously it's called Agile because it's supposed to be able to respond to change, and so doing that over having a plan. So when you think about a waterfall methodology and it being step by step, and this has to happen before this happens, that seems to be a lot more in line with the way that the government likes to do things and likes to see things, than being able to really have the ability to change quickly. And one of the things you'll see on this slideshow, and I did it purposefully, is the green boxes down at the bottom are a burn down chart. It's one of the things that you learn in Agile. And so it should show us where we are on the roadmap. I've removed a couple of the slides from the last briefing, so you might see it go down by 2 a couple of times, but that's just an example of when you're doing Agile, a burn down chart is something that you would expect to see, and so that's why it's here at the bottom. So in addition to the manifesto, there are 12 Agile principles, and we'll go over those really quickly. And so one is satisfying your customers through early and continuous delivery. So you're always looking to get to a minimally viable product, the thing that you can give the customer to show them as quickly as possible, and then you iterate after that, and you look to continuously give them something that they can then take and either use if they're the end user, or sell if they're a company or an organization that's going to sell that product to somebody else. Again, we're looking at welcoming requirements even late in the project. So if you're looking to use Agile in your daily work, I think that's one of the things that you have to think about is the job that I'm doing something that I can welcome changes even late? I use a lot of the time the example of building a house. Building a house is one of those things that becomes pretty difficult to welcome changes late in the process. If you that there's different time points where changes become either very costly or just, not able to be done at all. Once you signed off with the architect, it's going to be difficult to change those plans. Once you poured the foundation, it's going to be difficult to add a room. Once done the electricity, it's going to be difficult to make changes to where you have outlets or things like that. So that might be a job where waterfall methodologies work a lot better than agile. And so I encourage anybody that's thinking about using agile to think about that number two really hard before you do. Delivering value frequently. We'll talk a little bit later about sprints and sprint lengths, but making sure that you are regularly delivering something of value. Breaking up silos. So inside of software development, application development, and a lot of the jobs that we do, not everybody has the same expertise. And so either access to data or access to those people with the different expertise is breaking those silos is really critical in order to be successful at agile. And then I really like number 5, and it's building projects around motivated individuals. And so if you've got somebody on your team that is, we'll go to application development just because I'm familiar with it, that's a really good SQL developer, and that's what they're passionate about and that's what they're really good about, that person should be the center of that agile team. If you've got a really good Tableau visualization creator that can make really great dashboards that people really like, that person should be the center of your team, and your product or your sprints and your product should be centered around those people because they're motivated and they're going to push the product forward. And then 6, the most effective way to communicate face-to-face. It's funny that we're saying that, over a Teams meeting, and I know it's something that has become less popular post-pandemic, but I do think that there's still a lot of truth to that as we look at making applications, as we look at doing software, even as we look at doing different cost estimating, briefing independent cost estimates and things like that. Face-to-face communication has a lot of value. And in this, it really is critical at different points in time. And then working software is the primary measure of progress. Again, this is a software thing. You could input, white papers if that's what you make, or cost estimates, or whatever that is in there. But giving something of value is the primary measure of progress. It's not how many hours you work. It's not how much data you've collected. It's not how many any of that. It's really what is the product that you're giving to a customer. That's the primary measure of progress. Have you given something of value to your customer? Maintaining a sustainable working pace. So one of the things that we really are challenged with is making sure that we don't go too slow, but we also don't go too fast. It's really easy to get drawn in and say during one time period we're going to give a whole lot of value, and then in the following week we're trying to catch up and not able to give any value. And that's not consistent with an agile principle of giving a bunch of value 1 week or 1-2 week period and then no value for a month because you're making up for all the work that you weren't able to do, or you work people too many hours or things like that. So making sure it's a sustainable, consistent working pace. Continuous excellence enhances agility. So this talks about the fact that if you've given your customer or your boss or whoever is the person that you're giving stuff to a consistently good product, they're going to trust you more, and that's going to help you be more agile. Simplicity is essential. We'll talk about that as we get into building a sprint, that you don't want too many things in one sprint. You don't want that to be too diverse. You want it to be really simple. Self-organizing teams generate the most value. Just kind of in the same vein as number 5, building a product around a motivated individual, letting a team self-organize around people that work well together, that have complementary skills and things like that generate the most value, rather than having a set team that you have designated that Jill's going to work with Bob's going to work with Tim, and that's the way it's always going to be. That generates less value. It causes more issues, things like that. And then regularly reflect and adjust the way you work to boost your effectiveness. So that goes into sprint retrospectives and things like that we'll talk about as to how do you make things better. And so George had talked about the Excel, time for that now. And so if you all have pulled that up, I'm going to go over in case anybody's got any issues with it. But it's an Excel called Shall We Play a Game? And it's got 2 tabs on it. And if you're even, if you have an even birth date, so 1962, 74, 80, go to that tab. If you are an odd birth date, so 65, 73, 83, something like that, go to that tab. And what we're going to do is I'm going to give you, so if you are a even birth date, I'm going to give you 30-second time hacks. And you are going to go down column A, which is animal names, and you'll go down it for 30 seconds. And then once I say 30 seconds is up, move on, you'll go to row B and you'll do department stores and name all of the department stores that you can come up with in that time period. And then I'll give you another time hack and say move on to country name, and you'll go down the country name for 30 seconds as well. If you were an odd birth year, what you are going to do is you're going to go across. So you don't need to listen to my time hack, but what you need to do is you need to starting, A5 and do an animal name, and then go to B5 and do a department store, and then go to C5 and do a country name. And you're going to go across like that for the full minute and a half. You don't need to listen to the time hacks; they don't apply to you. And then we'll put the score in the chat with our, and even if you were on the even one and an odd if you were on the odd one. I'm going to give just 1 second in case anybody has any questions. They can either unmute and let me know or type it in. Okay, not seeing anybody typing, so I'm going to pull up my clock and stopwatch. And I will start the stopwatch, and the even folks will go down for 30 seconds. The others will go across for the full time. All right, and go ahead and start. Even birth years move on to department stores. Even birth years move on to country names. And everyone should stop. Okay, so it should on BC1 should give you a total score. And so if you can just put odd if you were in the odd group, or even if you were in the even birth group, and the number. Thanks, Dan. And so I would usually, in a longer meeting, take the time to go through and tally all of these up and give you a breakdown of the odd versus even numbers. But as you kind of scroll through the chat, I think what you see is that the even numbers had, the even numbers were quite a bit higher on average than the odd numbers. It looks like the odd numbers were down around, 12, 13, 15, 18, things like that. And the odds were down around the 10, 15 number, and the evens were up around, 36, 34, things like that. And that's kind of what we expect to see. So going back to the slideshow, context switching, everybody not everybody, a lot of the people that I talk to think they're really good at multitasking, right? I remember when I first started at CAPE and we were doing virtual work, I had one call on my phone, I was watching a call on my computer, and I was working on a cost estimate, and I thought I was doing really good work because I was multitasking 3 different things at once. But what I was really doing was not getting very much out of any of the meetings I was listening to, and the work that I was doing wasn't very effective either. And so as this slide that we're looking at now talks about context switching, and what you really kind of see, and again, I've not done the numbers on URLs, but consistently when I've given this talk before, is you see it fit that row number 3 pretty well. So when you're trying to do 3 different things at once, you're able to put 20% of your effort into doing those things, and you lose about 40% to waste. And so what we saw with that switching was the folks that were able to go down the column and just think animal names the whole time for 30 seconds, and they got into a rhythm of cat, dog, moose, bear, things like that, and then they moved on to the next thing, versus the person that had to go across and think of a bear, and then what's the department store, just Kohl's Count, okay, I'll put that down, and so you lose a lot of waste, or you have a lot of waste when you're trying to do that multitasking. And so regardless of whether or not you're ever going to do an agile methodology, I think this is something of value that folks can take from the agile methodology, is if you're in that position, if you're a worker and you're having all of that waste, how can you manage your own day in order to minimize that? How can you stay off of your email and not be tempted to go over every time it pings to see what that is, because you're losing so much waste? If you're a supervisor, I think the value is, how do you guard your folks' time and not how do you make sure that other people aren't able to go in and give them additional things to do, or higher priorities or different priorities all of the time? If you're looking at agile methodology, and we'll get to this in a little bit, as you're building your project that you're going to work on, making sure that you've got the most limited number of things, of different things, like that gets back to that simplicity principle, that the least things that you can have to focus on is going to minimize that amount of waste. And so really quickly, we'll go over the Scrum methodology. I'm not going to hit all of these things, but and we'll get into some of them more in depth later, but we're going to start at the bottom left-hand side. You build your scope. So what is the thing you're wanting to do? I want to create I think I've used writing a song before. And so I want to write a song, and that's the thing I want to do. And so what's the product backlog that I need to do? I need to market the song. I need to write the lyrics. I need to write the tune. I need to come up with a dance routine. All of these different things might go into the product backlog. And then I'm going to skip the design, but we're going to go into a sprint planning meeting. And so a sprint planning meeting, you're then looking at that product backlog and seeing which of those things are ready to go into a sprint. And once they're ready to go into a sprint, you can then bring them out of the product backlog into the sprint backlog, which is that next green arrow. And then once it's in the sprint backlog, it's going to get executed in the sprint. And so you see that up at the very top. And we'll get into a sprint, I think, in a couple of slides with a little bit more details, but just quickly for this slide, a sprint is a time bucket. It might be 5 days, it might be 2 weeks, it might be a month. It depends on what product you're doing and the necessity for how much time it takes. But so that's how long a sprint is. Each day you have a daily scrum. And the way I did it when I was at DIA was we literally had a 30-minute stand-up where everybody would just stand up or turn around from the cubicles that they were in, and we would talk about what were the things we were working on today, what were the things that were going to keep us from being able to do those things, what help did we need, things like that. And it's just a really quick daily scrum where you're hitting the highlights of what you're doing. Once you have finished a sprint, you do a sprint review meeting. The sprint review meeting is with the folks that are either your customer or your product owner that's going to actually look at the thing that you have made. So you should be able to demonstrate it or give it to them and let them use it on their own. And then the sprint retrospective is an internal meeting that you have where you're talking about what went well, what could have gone better, and try to, again, with that continuous improvement of it. And so that's just a really quick overview of what the Scrum methodology looks like. There are 3 artifacts that you get out of a sprint, and or out of a Scrum methodology or an agile methodology. It's the product backlog that we already talked about. That's the requirements from our stakeholders or our customers. It's the sprint backlog, which is the groomed stories. We'll talk about grooming stories a bit later. And then the increment, the thing of value, whether it's a increased application for software, whatever that thing is that you can give somebody of value. So those are the 3 things that you're looking to give out of an agile methodology. And so the bottom thing can also be called a potentially deliverable product. And the reason we call it that is because it's up to the customer to make the decision as to whether or not they deliver it. But the thing that we give a customer, if we're developing an application or a piece of software, we want that to be completely ready to be integrated into their software, or that they can take that software and sell it to a customer. The only reason that they would not is because they decide, based on marketing or whatever, that there's not enough value to sell that on its own, and they're going to wait for you to give more iterations to sell. But there's not anything to where it's like, oh, we have to wait for more data, or we have to wait for an upgrade to the system or something like that. It needs to be deliverable if the customer decides to do that. And so that's the thing that we're selling. If you're doing a cost estimate, it would be the model is completely done, the memo is done, this is ready to brief to the boss. It's just your boss's decision as to whether or not they want to take that forward and actually brief it, or if they want to wait for something more to brief. So we talked about sprint, but this is the full definition of it. It's a short time box period of time that you use to set how much work can get done. And again, it really depends on what you're making. If you can't make a piece of software or an application or a cost estimate in a 2-week period that would be valuable to a customer, then make it 3 weeks. If that's too long and you're not able to keep it simple during that time period, then make your sprint a week. But it's up to you and the team as to how long that sprint should be, how long that time period should be. A Scrum team, this is another critical piece of it. A Scrum team is made up of the experts that you need to make the product. If it's, a SQL developer and a Tableau developer and a few data analysts, whatever that would be, to be able to make the thing that you are looking to make. And it's usually between 5 to 9 individuals. And the thing about keeping it small is that you're able to keep everybody busy on a few simple things, rather than having to have a ton of different things where different people are working on different items and causing that context switching that we realized during the game. And a critical piece of this is there's no rank or hierarchy with it. It doesn't matter if one person's a GS12 and another person's a GS15. If you're on a Scrum team, everybody is the same during that sprint. We talked about the product backlog. So we get it from our stakeholders, we get it from our customers, and it comes in really raw. I think most of you would probably agree that when you get a requirement from your boss, when your boss tells you what they want, it's usually not really what they want, and it's usually pretty unclear. And so what we do is we take that thing and we put it into the product backlog, and then over time you're able to refine it. And so that's the job of the product owner. The product owner goes back to the customer, back to the stakeholders, and asks, what did you really mean by this? What do you need from this? What priority is this? And so you're able to keep refining that until it gets to a point where it's something that you can that you understand well enough that you can create the thing or you can do the job. And so that's where the product backlog comes in. And I really like having a big product backlog because it gives you a lot of things to choose from. When you have a really slim pickings in your product backlog, it makes it quite difficult to be able to figure out what you're going to put into your next sprint. And then a sprint backlog. So once you've groomed those items in the backlog and they get to a point where you can actually complete them in a sprint, in a 2-week period, if that's what you're doing for your sprints, then you can move it into the sprint backlog, which means it's sprint ready and it's going to get executed in the next sprint. And I like, and when I was at DIA, what I always did was I would have just a really short title. It was, this is sprint 22, the 22nd sprint, but then it was dash a name. It was, I don't know, human resources dashboard or, something like that, to where I knew what was the goal of that sprint, really clear. That way, as it says on, I think, the 4th line, you're trying to avoid having scope creep. And that's easy to do when you've got a bunch of different tasks going into a sprint. And so that finishes that section. And so the next section is what do my customers want? What does my customer want? And those are the things that we'll talk about. And so I think it's important for us to understand our customers and to build a product around their needs. And with us, I think one of the challenges at least at OSD, when I was at DIA, and with the folks I talked to at the Army Inclusion and Diversity Agency, we have a lot of different types of customers. So I assume you all would as well. And so understanding those different customers and that they might not always have the same needs is really an important part, because I'm not going to, the tool I build might have to both meet a SES, I'll use myself for example. It might have to meet an SES's needs at OSD, and it also might need to meet a cost estimator at the Army's need, and it also probably has an impact on soldier level things as to if they're collecting the data for us or things like that. So there's a lot of different folks that might be impacted, and one of the ways that I have found valuable to figure that out is I like to create a caricature-driven persona of the customer. And so at DIA, I worked for a guy who was, an older, like DIA senior leader, and he was really crass, and he, didn't care that much about data analytics. He just wanted, really simple. And so anytime I was doing a news story and I was looking for a persona, I would use, him as the caricature, or at least a caricature of him as, the old, kind of angry guy that doesn't really care about data but wants the thing done. And that was the character or caricature that I would use for that customer. And then you might have other customers, or really needy and want, all of the bugs fixed, things like that. And so you can build all of these different personas so that you think through them as you're building these user stories. And that'll make sense in just a minute. And so why write a user story? We want to keep it focused on the user, on the customer. It enables us to, collaborate with the customers. We can drive creative solutions, and they create momentum because you start to finish one story, and that might give you ideas for new stories, new sprints that you want to build, or it might help the customer to understand that the thing they'd asked for earlier wasn't really what they needed. And so you can start to build momentum off of these user stories. And so this is a pretty busy slide, but how do you write a user story? I like to write a user story and make it customer focused. And this is why I need that caricature of my customers, because as a crass senior leader at DIA, I want to have a really simple dashboard that I can go to pull whatever. And so that's the way you would write a customer-focused user story, where you've got these customers that you are writing it off of. It needs to be sprint sized again. So you have to get it down to the size to where it can be done in one sprint, and you can give that potentially deliverable product. And then it needs to have acceptance criteria, because this is what we're going to look at to make sure that we've finished it. So given that you push this button on this dashboard, it will go to this URL and you will see the Excel spreadsheet that you requested. So that's the acceptance criteria that you would build on a user story. And the other way that you can think about it is the acronym INVEST. And so a user story needs to be independent of all other user stories. So it's not dependent that you have to do some other user story in the future. It might be based off of a user story in the past, but it's not dependent on another user story that's going to happen 2 sprints from now. It's independent. It's negotiable. We can go back and make sure that we understand what the customer needs and make changes to those specific requirements. It's valuable. When we finish this, the customer can sell this, or they can get value out of it. It's estimable, which we will get into how you estimate a user story, but it's at least something that you and your team can determine how long is it going to take and how valuable it might be. It's, again, small, so it will fit within a single sprint, and it's testable in that you're able to see if it met all of those acceptance criteria that we have written out for it. And so a few odds and ends for this. There should be outline tasks and subtasks. So in a user story, you can have tasks, you can have subtasks, and those things might go back onto like the kind of waterfall methodology that the different tasks need to happen in certain order. So that goes to the ordered steps. And then you have to be able to listen to feedback throughout the sprint. And so the last section is, how do you get this all done? I think this is the last section. It might have one more. So one is grooming a user story. And so I think that there's a value in these 3 people coming together: the customer that's actually paying for the product, the leadership of your organization that's managing your time, and then the developers, the people that are actually doing the work. And so bringing all of those people together in order to groom the backlog and create a user story is critical, because the customer wants, this nice package that's got tied with a bow. The leadership cares, when am I going to be able to give this to the customer? So that's got the clock. And the developers really care about, what tasks do you want me to do, and when are those tasks going to be ready for me to do them? And so bringing those folks together allows us to groom the backlog, keep it up to date, and keep it prepared for the upcoming sprints. And so one of the ways that we do this is planning poker, or at least this is the way that we estimate how much work there is to a certain user story. And so when you've got a user story, I think the user story said earlier was, I want to write a song. And so if that's the user story, and I bring the lead singer and the dance choreographer and the marketer and the bass player all together, and we're going to play planning poker. And so there's cards that have the Fibonacci sequence on it. If you're not familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, it's in the box to the right. Each number is the sum of the previous two numbers. And so you give that to everybody that's there, and then we're looking at the user stories for writing this song. And so if the user story that we're looking at for this week is or for this sprint is we're going to write the lyrics of the song, then everybody would throw down a card, and the lead singer, who's going to be doing most of the writing, they might throw down a 55, and the marketer might throw down a 2, and the dance choreographer might put an 8. And so what we're able to do is eventually to discuss this so that everyone understands how much effort there is required. This isn't necessarily how much time, it's just how difficult it is. And as you do this more and more, teams get better at being able to tell how difficult different items are because you've done them in the past, and then also how many of these items you can fit into a sprint. And so if you've got a big spread, so I think it's like if you have 3 cards in between, so if one person puts down a 1 and the other person puts down an 8, then you have to play the game again. So you can't have that much difference between. So that's when you have a discussion. But if everybody puts down a 2 or a 3 for how difficult whatever the task or whatever the user story is going to be, then it doesn't really matter. We make it a 2.5 and we move on. It should be really quick unless there is a big variance between the people that are playing so that everyone can understand that. And so that's the way that we estimate how difficult the user stories are going to be in the backlog. So what do we do when the user stories are too big? So let's say on the Fibonacci sequence, we get an 89, and we know that in the past, we've only been able to do 34 user points or story points in a 2-week period or in a sprint. And so what do? Well, we break it up. So you have to know what your limits are. And so that story that was an 89 might be important that those things kind of stay together, but to make them independent of one another, we make the big story an epic. So it's an epic. And then we have multiple stories underneath of it. And then most of you are probably like me, you're probably math folks, so we've probably not looked at a grammar book for a long time, but it's helpful in this context. And that's that you can pull it out, and if you see words like easy, fast, flexible, those cool buzzwords that people want to put into what the marketing person might want to put, those aren't very helpful for a developer. So we want to go back and say, what does easy mean? I want to know if you want a radial button or a number input, or how do you want to input those numbers? What do you consider easy if I'm doing a dashboard or something like that? And then if you see conjunctions, which are like or and things like that, then that probably means that this user story has multiple features that you can split out separately. And so that might be a helpful way to see where could that big story become an epic, and where are those little stories broken out from with the conjunctions. And so once you've done that, then you can take the easy path. So if there's a really easy way forward that you could, maybe it's writing the chorus of the song that we're trying to do. And so let's make that the user story if writing the full lyrics is too much, but we think we can write the chorus in a 2-week period. All right, well, let's write the chorus. And then the next sprint will be writing the first verse. And then the next story will be writing the second verse. And, something like that, to where you're able to break it up and then keep taking those paths until you've written all of the lyrics to this song. And then, testable is bestable. So we're looking for something that's clear, it's measurable, it's complete, it's all of those things, so that we can test to see, did we actually do the things that the customer asked for in that user story? And then moving it up, you're going to move that user story up to where it's out of the product backlog and it's ready to go into the sprint backlog. Once you have groomed it, you've made it the right size, you've given it a amount of story points, and then you've looked to see when does the user story fit into a planned sprint goal. So a sprint might have more than one user story. It probably shouldn't have a bunch of user stories, but it might have more than one. But even if it has more than one, all of those user stories should fall under the umbrella of that sprint goal. And then I think this is potentially my last slide. And so how do you make this work for your team? And so again, we talked about simplicity when we talked about context switching. We talked about simplicity in some of the principles. Keeping a singular priority of effort allows us to swarm on the task at hand. So if I've got if I'm developing a database and I've got 3 or 4 different user stories that aren't very similar, and a lot of them require my SQL developer to be doing things, then I'm asking that SQL developer to do a lot of context switching as they work the different user stories from different angles. And that's going to reduce their effectiveness and reduce our ability to swarm on that. So keeping singular efforts. The sprint teams can clearly articulate what obstacles are keeping them from delivering their product. So I think having that product backlog is super beneficial, because I can then show my boss exactly why I have not done the application or the part of the application that they're asking me about, because I can show it's here in the product backlog. I remember that I need to do it. I've been grooming it, but you have not gotten me the data that I need, or you have not gotten me the user agreement to be able to do this with this organization, or whatever that might be. You can go back to the folks that are able to alleviate those problems and clearly show them why the thing that they're asking for has not gotten done yet, and why it's, you know, on them as much as it is on you to get that sprint ready. So I like the third bullet, priority items that are not sprint ready. So there's things that might be really important to my boss, don't impact the priority items that are already being worked in the current sprint. And so it's really easy for somebody to come in and say, the SecDef or, you know, the director asked for this thing, we've got to do it. But with the way that we do sprints, if we do them correctly, that's not going to impact the sprint that we've already got going. And if it does, it should be a very big deal. If we decide to stop a sprint and do something else, it should be a very clearly made decision, not something that's lightly taken. And so we're going to fail this sprint because you want us to work on this thing that is not sprint ready, but that you've decided is important to you. And they have to understand that. And again, the fourth one, leadership can see the issues, they can help to alleviate those, and they can see when those might go into a future sprint. And then again, we've talked about it, customers receive a tangible product. So it's not very useful to tell somebody about something or to give somebody a PowerPoint on the application that you will create for them at some point in the future. But if you're able to give them a minimally viable product that they're actually able to open on their computer on their free time and work with, they will then come back to you with what works well, what doesn't work well, what do they need. But if you take 2 years to get that to them because you're doing a waterfall methodology to where you don't give it to them until it's all, you know, completely done, then by the time you get it to them, their priorities may have changed, their needs may have changed, their requirements may have changed, and the thing that you give them no longer meets the needs that they had. But by giving them that tangible product at the end of every 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, you're allowing them to test it, refine it, realize that the thing they asked for wasn't really what they wanted before you've gotten so far that you can't make those changes. And so, yeah, that was my last slide. I know we've got about 8 minutes. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions and go back to any slides anybody wants to talk more about. But I really appreciate your guys' time. I hope this was helpful.
Absolutely. It looks like we've got a question in the chat there.
Yeah. Hey, Dan. I put a question in the chat. How do you identify and mitigate a major supply chain schedule slip from one of the sole source suppliers as you're going down the current sprint? How do you mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things, Steve. One would be that if this is something that is reliant upon thing A happening before thing B happening before thing C inside of the 2-week period, then the task that you're doing might not be an agile friendly task, and it might be something that does need to be done waterfall style, like we talked about with building a house. If that's something that rarely happens, and it's something that the task has been shown that it could benefit from an agile methodology, I think we need to not be so afraid to have a failed sprint. So this happens to us. It happened to me at DIA, where you think you're going to get a data agreement, or you think you're going to get a data access in that 2-week period. And so you bring that user story into this sprint, and you're working it and you're doing the connections, and 4 days in, you realize that data owner's not going to give me the data, or I have started to try to connect to that API and I can't connect to that API with this, it's not going to work. At that point, you talk to your boss and you call it a failed sprint, and you learn from it. You have a sprint retrospective. You go back, you spend some time doing some backlog grooming of other stories. You put that story back into the backlog, and then once you've gotten that data agreement in place, once you've gotten the connection to that API, or in your instance, once you've gotten that slippage taken care of, you bring that user story back in at that point in time, and hopefully it's more prepared to be able to execute. So I think the two things. One is the process that you're doing actually friendly toward agile methodology? If not, then probably doing waterfall or some other program management technique is more appropriate. And then two, if it was agile friendly, don't be afraid to bring in things and have the chance that you may have a failed user story that you'll have to learn, or a failed sprint that you'd have to learn from. Over.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I understand a failed sprint. This thing is just started. It just said, the supplier said, "Oh yeah, we'll get it done next week," and then it ends up turning into 3 months, and it just held up the entire team, the entire project. But anyhow, hey, very good presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I don't know if your contact information is somewhere, but anyways, thanks a lot for being on today.
Yeah, thanks. No problem. Yeah.
Dan, I'd like to share my screen if I could here for this, just for everyone could give some feedback for today's presentation as well. I'll do that now. And then if there's any other questions, we can continue here. That work? Yeah, oops. I don't know if that worked. Hang on. Share this screen. Do people see that screen? This is the form that we use. You scan the QR code. You can give us feedback for today's presentation, and it helps us to shape future presentations and to choose a winner for the Luncheon Speaker Presentation Excellence Award for 2023. Anyone else have any other questions for our speaker here today, for Dan?
I will comment that Mr. Miller put a good comment in the chat for Steve's question. It is why you have a prioritized backlog. So as you've pulled out those most ready sprints or user stories, or you've pulled out the ones that were the highest priority or the ones that fell under the sprint goal for that sprint, when you have that thing happen that makes the sprint fall apart, you can move those out and bring in another user story that is groomed and is the higher priority, or is the one that falls under that sprint's goal, so that you do have the product backlog prioritized and listed as to whether or not it's sprint ready or not. So you could switch those out and potentially not have a failed sprint. I think from Steve's second comment, I think it seems like he's talking about it more from a customer perspective, that the person that's supposed to be delivering a product of value keeps letting it slip. And I mean, I think that goes to the management piece of the product owner should be having those discussions with the stakeholder or the customer, or in a contract environment, the contract manager, to where we're able to figure out what do you need to do differently if you keep having this, if this sprint, if sprint 22 was supposed to happen 3 weeks ago and it's now, 6 weeks later and they still say it's slipping, and that's all you're getting, then it's having a conversation with those leaders inside of the sprint team to make sure that they're doing something different and no longer putting the thing that is, the supply chain slippage as the reason that their sprint failed or gets pushed time after time. So that's a management piece more if you're looking at it from the customer of a sprint team. Over.
Very good. Anyone else have any other questions?
George, this is Dan Germoni, chapter president. Just big shout out, Colonel. Thanks for your time today, briefing us for the second time. Great presentation and great to learn more about Agile. I'm going to try to take that don't multitask message to heart, because I think you're absolutely spot on. But again, thank you on behalf of the chapter and ICEAA for the great presentation today.
Thanks, Dan. I saw Jeremy's hand go up a couple of times. Jeremy, do you have a question really quick before we pop off? Sorry, Dan, to do it.
Well, it's a quick question. It may not be a quick answer. What if you have a development project that has multiple teams and they are working simultaneously? It seems like it would be absolute mayhem because they're constantly delivering. I mean, they're probably not all on the same sprint schedule. Is there's something being delivered daily? How does that work in the real world?
So yeah, and Dan Germoni and I have had this discussion a few times. When you've got 30 or 40 people, that's not a sprint team. So that's multiple sprint teams. And so breaking those folks out and being able to have 3 or 4 sprint teams, and there's different ways to do it, right? So I mean, sometimes if you're doing a big software development piece, you might have a few coders, a few data experts, a few, whatever the team needs to have on each one of those teams. Or you can also do it to where it kind of follows the waterfall piece, where you've got one team that is your data collectors, and they're out there, grooming the data and finding the data and things like that. And they're doing that piece. And then you've got another team that's doing more of the, database development. And then you've got another team that's delivering that to the customer. And so you might have it to where your sprint teams are, if it's, a continuous product, then to where they're doing it that way, to where you've got these different sprint teams that are doing very, very different things. If the project is just a really big project, you might have 4 or 5 sprint teams that are, mirrors of one another. And then you've got them, and you can either do it to where you've got one big product backlog to where they're all just grabbing the next priorities and taking them if the teams are really efficient like that. Or you can make the choice to where each one of those sprint teams has their own product backlog, and where you're putting the customer gets the task of, the customer gives you the task, and as the big product owner, the scrum master of that, you're putting that task into the product backlog of the team that you think is going to be most effective for that. And that's called a scrum of scrums. And so there's really a scrum going on to figure out which scrum team should have that in their product backlog. And so they have unique product backlogs. So I guess that gives you kind of 3 different ways to handle that. That you either have it to where you do the scrum of scrums, you do it to where you've got one big product backlog that 3 or 4 teams that are mirrors of one another are doing, or if you've got a long project, you're doing 3 or different teams that have really different expertise, and they work it that way. Over.
All right. Any final questions? I know we're a bit over here, but Colonel Summers, thank you very much. It's an amazing presentation. I appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for participating. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, April 19th at 11:30. Software Cost Estimating, Friend or Foe to Agilists by Carol Deckers. And if you have any other suggestions for a new topic for a luncheon, please email us at luncheon@washingtonicea.com and visit our website. Thank you very much, everybody. Any final questions? Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.